You on Eminent Speaker Series organized by IRS. Today we have Honorable Dr. IAN Talbot with us to share his insights on India and Pakistan's interesting relationship, which is inevitable owing to geographical reality, of course, but it always has some friction in it. Dr. Talbot, in one of his works, has referred to it as enduring rivalry. So before I introduce Dr. Talbot, I would request President IRS, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz, to formally welcome our esteemed speaker and say a few words about the topic. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and a good morning and a good afternoon to people in different parts of the world. I gather that, the beauty of these webinars is that you can actually reach out to people all over the globe. I think we are really honored and privileged to have Dr. Talbot with us today. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. And I am really looking forward to listening to your views and ideas about a topic which is of great significance and importance to us. I've been a former diplomat, I spent nearly 36, 37 years in the Foreign Office of Pakistan, serving in various capitals. And honestly speaking, Pakistan desires good relations with India, because I think that is absolutely essential for economic development, for the betterment of the region, for even regional connectivity. But somehow, it's a relationship which has always been difficult, and it has become practically an impossible relationship, I think, especially after the Indian actions on the 5th of August, 2019. There is virtually no official communication between the two governments the way it should be. And so there is really a stalemate. Now, this stalemate actually affects a lot of things. It affects trade within the region. It affects the working of the regional organization SAARC. It actually even affects having common policies to fight a pandemic like COVID. So where do we go from here? Obviously, Pakistani leadership does desire that we should have good relations with India. But if you look at the Hindutva policies of the BJP government, in that it is not conducive for them to get into a meaningful dialogue with Pakistan. Now, how long will this stalemate remain? What is the future? Can the two countries exist like this for the foreseeable future, basically meaning for the next few years? And are there any low-hanging fruits without really solving the 4 decades, the nearly the 7 decades old dispute of Kashmir? So, these are all the questions which one has in mind. And I think we are really, really honored to have such a distinguished speaker with us today. And with these very words, I welcome you again, sir. And we look forward to hearing from you. And we look forward to a very interactive question-answer session. Thank you very much, Mariam, for organizing this. And over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So without further ado, I will now introduce Professor IAN Talbot. Though he doesn't need any introduction but for youngsters, I will share some details. Professor IAN Talbot is a professor in history of modern South Asia at the University of Southampton. His key interests are in the fields of the history of the colonial Punjab, the 1947 partition of India, and the history of Pakistan. He has published 10 monographs and 3 jointly written volumes in these areas, along with numerous book chapters and articles. His most recent publications are Punjab and the Raj, A History of Modern South Asia, Colonial Lahore, A History of the City and Beyond, co-written with Tahir Kamran. He is currently an elected council member of the Royal Asiatic Society He was previously chair of the British Association for South Asian Studies and a member of the British Academy South Asian Panel. He has held visiting fellowships at the University of Warwick and Oxford. Most recently, he has also worked as a senior visiting research fellow at the South Asia Institute, Harvard University. So, with this brief introduction, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mariam, for that introduction. And thank you very much also for setting up, really, this opportunity to share some thoughts with you. I'm going to follow on, in a sense, what has already been spoken of, which is the fact that on so many for so many reasons, India and Pakistan relations really do need to be normalized. We've heard about the economic benefits for so long, the so-called peace dividend. We've also, of course, heard about the opportunities for greater connectivity in the region. And I was pleased to hear about SAARC being mentioned today, because SAARC has really got great potential for regional trade and socio-economic development and cooperation. And yet its development has really been held up badly by the poor relationship between India and Pakistan over the years. And there are other problems with SAARC as well, but this is one factor in this. One other point I would make, which I think is important, whilst the pandemic has been a major crisis and has been resolved throughout the world in terms of really national responses to this, I fear that the coming climate emergency will actually be much greater in the long run and may actually pose an existential threat to Pakistan, but also to other countries in the South Asia region in the decades ahead. And that will require cooperation in order to be addressed and mitigated in any ways that it can be. As we all know, whilst the South Asia region doesn't contribute much to carbon emissions globally, it's the area that's most vulnerable to drought, to flooding, and of course the possibilities of making life impossible and leading to mass migrations across the region. So that these are all problems, I think, which are going to be coming in the coming decades of this century. And in order to address them, there's got to be a more normal relationship between these two very important countries, India and Pakistan, with their large populations, their rich cultural histories, their economic potentials, their youthful populations, and their potential for economic development and growth. And all of this is being held back by the long-running, now 7 decades crisis in India and Pakistan relations. Sometimes with a Cold War context. As we know, there's also been hot wars between the two countries. And much of this, of course, is centered around the Kashmir dispute, which I'm going to be speaking a little bit about in my presentation, because in many respects, whilst there are other causes of tension between India and Pakistan relating back to partition itself, and its longer-term impacts, the flashpoint always in relationships between India and Pakistan is over the Kashmir issue. So realistically, there's got to be some movement towards a resolution of that issue for, I think, sustainable and drastically improved relations between India and Pakistan. But of course, that is much easier to say than to achieve. There's been much diplomatic effort over decades in order to try and secure a resolution. And I've been interested to read in the press and commentary, even in the last week or so, how obviously the recent elections in Azad Jammu and Kashmir has once again returned people to think about plebiscites, to think about potential futures for the Kashmiri people in order to try and bring about the circumstances which there could be as a result. Not only the ending of the agony of the Kashmiri people over decades, but also this really called for improvement in India-Pakistan relations. Just want to make a couple of very general points and then look at some of the historical insights into how this relationship between India and Pakistan has worked and hasn't worked, and whether we can draw any lessons from that in terms of what could perhaps be achieved going forward, both in the short term and in the longer term. The immediate current context, of course, is, I suppose, a position of more volatility than there's been for a number of years, both because of what is a belligerent BJP government in office in New Delhi, but also because of changes within the region. And India-Pakistan relations must, of course, always be understood in terms of wider global context. They were very much anchored for many years in the Cold War. And then, of course, the so-called war on terror also impacted on relations. And the region is becoming less predictable and more volatile, as we all know, because of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the uncertainties within Afghanistan itself. And of course, India has interest in Afghanistan. There's also, of course, the uncertainties in terms of Western attempts in the future to try and contain China. And that will obviously impact on India-Pakistan relations, partly because of Pakistan's long-term friendship with China, but also, of course, because of the fact that Western strategic thinking sees India as playing an important role in any containment of China. So these are potentially very volatile situations that will impact from outside on this long-running tension between India and Pakistan. Are there any glimmers of possible improvements? Some people were hoping that the 25th of February 2021 joint statement of the Directors General of Military Operations recommitting India and Pakistan to the 2003 line of control ceasefire arrangements might be a signal for improvement. Obviously, again, there have been in the last 2 or 3 years numerous violations of that ceasefire, which of course brings a heavy toll on civilian populations, as well as, of course, it's part of this general tension between India and Pakistan, which of course is affecting diplomatic relations and is certainly creating the circumstances where it seems very difficult to see positive ways forward. However, I would argue that there may be potentials for improvement. And one way of identifying perhaps some of these is to look very briefly. I don't want to give you a potted history of the past 7 decades of relations, but I want to pick out really 6 points from India-Pakistan relations, most of them, of course, relating to Kashmir, because, as I say, this is at the heart of the problems. And the starting point, really, the first point, is what I've already referred to, that there are other causes of mistrust, of course, but I think, relatively speaking, some of the other issues which divide India and Pakistan would be much more resolvable if the core issue of Kashmir was resolved in some way that gave not only justice for the Kashmiri people, but a sense of closure to this long-running dispute, which of course dates back to the colonial inheritance, and it has to be resolved, I think, in a way that doesn't lead to a win-lose situation for all of the actors in this, but somehow or other got to be a win-win situation. This is difficult, of course, because the second point, looking at any history of the Kashmir dispute, is that this is a conflict which is multi-dimensional in terms of its actors, multi-layered in terms of the issues that need to be addressed, including those of identity, territory, law, sovereignty, self-determination. And of course, the actors in this conflict, Kashmiri, Indian, Pakistani, over the decades have increasingly moved to diametrically opposite interests and agendas relating to all of these issues which are at stake, creating what could be seen as a seemingly intractable problem for conflict resolution and peace finally in the Kashmir region. The evolution since 1947, and I'm moving on to my third point, has, I think, revealed that there's not going to be any overnight solutions. It's going to involve gradual movement, and the reference has already been made to low-hanging fruit. It may be that along with confidence building issues, there may be a need to resolve other, and that's often in the past been in terms of opening up transportation networks, encouraging people-to-people contact, as we all are aware. It may be there are other things like a resolution of the Siachen glacier issue. I've read recently that one person was talking about creating a peace park, as has happened in other conflict zones there, though I'm not sure quite how that would work. But there are areas like Sear Creek and Siachen, which might be the first staging post to a resolution of the much trickier and, of course, much more intractable Kashmir dispute. What is clear, of course, and has happened over the decades, is that violence is not going to bring about a resolution to this, and that there's got to be ultimately some agreed dialogue between all of the actors in this dispute in order to move it forward. And I would argue that that dialogue has got to have Kashmiris at the core. It can't be something that is resolved between India and Pakistan over the heads of the Kashmiri people. Because of the fact, personally, I think they've suffered so much that they have to be involved in this, but also for any resolution to stick in the long term, it's got to be something which is owned and bought into by Kashmiris on both sides of the current division of the region. And if there is something that can be done which meets their interest and takes them into consideration in terms of discussions and dialogue and listens to them and encourages movement across the line of control, I think that that may eventually begin to perhaps recast some of these rather fixed positions which have been there for so many decades and seem to be impossible to resolve. And that will help us arrive at what I've called already as my fifth point, a win-win solution, in that every person or actor involved in this will see that there are benefits in some kind of resolution, which may not look like their original standing position, perhaps even, but may in other ways achieve their core interests. And that that will, of course, require courage and political will of a high order, and certainly past history has shown that while there have been moves which have sometimes got quite close to a resolution, ultimately the levels of mistrust, and this is a crucial issue, the levels of mistrust between India and Pakistan, and the lack of political will to move forward, and rather to maintain this very uneasy status quo, is prevented from the 1950s and 60s onwards, right the way up to the first decade of this century. There have been moments when there have been possibilities of moving forward in this to a resolution. Finally, that from a historical perspective, external actors, certainly for the period up until 1971, were very much involved in trying to mediate in this dispute, whether it was a cause for the Commonwealth to be involved, whether it was cause for the UN to be involved, or whether it was in terms of later American sort of influence and interest in the resolution of this in the Cold War context. But any resolution, of course, has to be one which is owned, as I say, by the Kashmiri people. It can't be imposed. It can't be mediated by outsiders, and presenting a resolution which may suit their strategic interests, but doesn't necessarily address issues, as I've said earlier, of justice for the Kashmiri people. So bearing these 6 historical insights in mind, I just want to turn to short-term scenarios before concluding. We could perhaps take this forward in the question and answer session with longer-term prospects. In the short term, we're obviously into a low point, but the history of India-Pakistan relations is of cycles, which are marked really by a pattern of intermittent crises, and I'm sure all the audience can think of crises moments, punctuated by perhaps limited détente, and certainly in this century by cosmetic changes in people-to-people contacts. Now, whilst it seems a very unpromising position to move forward from, for all the reasons I've said at the beginning, there have been, of course, movements forward from difficult situations. I'm thinking of 2001-2 and the military standoff between India and Pakistan, and how people at that time couldn't have conceived of the fact that within 3 or 4 years, the two countries, partly as a result of back-channel diplomacy, were actually moving closer than they'd been for many decades towards a resolution of the Kashmir issue. So one shouldn't get too down in terms of thinking about the possibilities just because we may be starting from a low point. That doesn't mean to say that there can't be movements. Of course, things have fundamentally changed in some respects after the 5th of August 2019. But here I would argue that probably the changes which the Modi government made then will eventually have to be pulled back from. This is, of course, a point which Pakistan is making constantly, that there can't be any dialogue unless there is a pullback from that position. And I think that it's an untenable position that India has created, not only, of course, for itself, but obviously in terms of the human costs on Kashmiris themselves. But I think it is untenable, and there may be limited steps to pull back from this position. They may have to perhaps go further under a post-Modi government, but nonetheless, even Modi himself has been perhaps aware of the problems it's creating, and of course had a meeting in February 2021 with some Kashmiri loyalists, it's true, in New Delhi, but nevertheless, that was in June, I should say, not February, in June, with Kashmiri leaders, some of whom had actually been arrested, although obviously the Hurriyat wasn't represented in these discussions. So that the realities, the ground realities will lead, I think, to a change in the Indian position. And that will then open up the possibility for dialogue. I just want to finish by saying, well, what can this dialogue achieve, perhaps in the medium term and perhaps in the longer term? And we've already mentioned that there have been in the dialogues, certainly in 2003-4 onwards up to 2008, confidence building issues, picked up measures that will improve the general mood music and will make it possible for mistrust to begin to be eroded, though it would take a long time to overcome these decades of mistrust. I've mentioned some low-hanging fruit. Something else which might be considered as a possibility. I don't think anyone has thought about it before, but perhaps looking at other peace processes. I'm thinking particularly about the Northern Ireland one. I know it's now been put into some jeopardy by Brexit, but certainly that process, very different context, of course, but it began to set up sort of institutions which were bringing together people from different communities, but also from different sides of the Irish border. And I wonder whether, for example, setting up a Kashmir tourism agency, something which is not going to be easily politicized, something which I think both countries could accept, which would include sort of Indian occupied Kashmir and Azad Jammu and Kashmir, in which there could be discussions about sort of how this could be managed, how it could be marketed, how this authority would be used then as a means to show that Indian and Pakistanis, and of course there has to be a Kashmiri input, as I've said throughout this whole process, that's vital, could be involved in something. And working together is always a very important factor in removing mistrust and giving people that may not have had any previous shared interests something that they can share together. I'm not saying that that creating something like that is going to lead overnight to a resolution of the Kashmir issue, but I think there's got to be opportunities for people to work together across these long-established divides, and again to try and make the borders, as was hoped for in the first decade of this century, more porous again, and to improve connections between them. But I'm going to finish then. I don't want to take up all the time with my presentation. I want to hear other people's comments and reflections and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Talbot, for your insights. You're very right. Kashmir is at the heart of the problem. We'll deliberate upon it in the Q&A session. But before that, I would really like to invite our first discussant to share her insights upon your talk. First, I would like to invite Dr. Shaheen Akhtar. Dr. Akhtar is an associate professor at the Department of International Relations at National Defense University. She has a vast experience of research as well as teaching. She was the first person in Pakistan to bring forth a comprehensive work on state of Muslims in India in 1993. She has been a recipient of various fellowships. And with this brief introduction, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mariam. And I'm glad to hear Professor Talbot, and I couldn't agree more what he said. I wish the word agreed to him, and especially those sitting in Delhi appreciate that, because um, this is something like has a lot of rationality, because I was also, when I started thinking on the subject, it was like if you look at the ground realities, they all demand for like more peace, stability, development. You have the rising population, you have the climate crisis hitting you very hard, you have the latest experience of pandemic, and you have rising population, you have energy crisis. So all actually say push you towards cooperation. You have SARC, and SARC has done a lot of work actually in terms of providing say analysis, how you can have more trade, connectivity, and people-to-people contact and everything. But somehow things have not been moving, and Kashmir has been a roadblock. Absolutely no doubt about it. Without really getting into all the details that Professor has shared, I would just really build on what is where we stand now, what is the like our future prospect. We had the spells of dialogue. We The latest one was the opposite dialogue. All that Professor indicated were very much part of those conversation. We have cross LOC CBMs on trade, on travel, on connectivity, which were doing very well actually. And the tourism that Professor you talked about, actually we had this started some conversation around that between the two sides of Kashmir actually. And there was a lot of say possibilities and say desire on both sides actually to really move ahead. And they were became also part of the conversation of say India Pakistan dialogue on Kashmir as well, when they agreed that they should start this religious pilgrims say religious tourism and all that. So the ideas were there. The idea about the peace park, Manmohan Singh himself said that we should turn it into the mountain of peace. So on Siachen, we nearly agreed to a settlement, and then the Indian side pulled out. Sir Creek has been, we were near like say agreement, low hanging say fruit, but still we couldn't make it. And the reason, to my understanding, have been the overall the political climate, the political relation between the two countries. On trade, similar thing happened. We started conversation on this MFN, most favored nation, and then say there was a say a stalemate again. And currently, you see that there is a stalemate, but the stalemate, to my understanding, is not. There is no indefinite stalemate. Either you say go get worse. I mean, the situation get worse, or you pull back. So there are both possibilities actually. There were some indications like with the resumption of the ceasefire on the line of control in February that maybe this is going to lead to say more dialogue or more normalization to start with. In fact, we are not even near normalization. And there were also prospects of like situation in Afghanistan, also pushing. There are shared interests, the common interests in the stability in Afghanistan as well for the both side and for the region and for the world, I would say. So there have been prospects which really bring two sides together. In fact, if there is a shared like understanding about the peace, stability, and development, there are a lot of prospects, and people have done a lot of work. I will just focus because with the shortage of time to build on what Professor said. Basically, what kind of dialogue is possible on Kashmir, where we stand now? And as you correctly also indicated, everybody say is very, I mean, clear that there is no military solution. So all kind of violence, all kind of military solutions are actually not leading to anywhere. So dialogue is the only methodology which is available to all sides to really build on. And it's not really one set of dialogue, multiple dialogue. There should be like the inclusion of the people, inclusivity. Those should be the principle. There's a need that they should be worked out very clearly what are the principle of that dialogue. Like in Northern Ireland, we have seen that the question of sovereignty, the aspiration of the people, then say the actors in different regions, how they can be brought in. So it will be like certain principles of like say dialogue should be clearly laid out, and people should be made part of those dialogue. While India and Pakistan are key actor, we know that they can be very much a part of those conversation. Then the say external facilitation, we tend to forget that there is an asymmetry of power which has been shaping conversation on Kashmir. So every time when UN came up with the plebiscite solution and the other also facilitated, somehow it really did not lead to say a final political settlement. So external facilitation, to my understanding, is very much important in that way, and the political will of the leaders. Lately, what we have seen is that the hyper nationalism on the say other side has actually created a situation where the domestic perception in India have been actually molded in a manner which were not there before, which has created a lot of I would say problem for those conversation to really start start off and there has to be like a de-escalation of this media belligerence which has really created a very negative environment. So only the leaders can really change that situation. I think we don't have much time, but those ideas, in fact, are centered around Kashmir, but very much the need of the hour, because the ground reality demand that the both sides actually work for peace, stability, and development in the region. And Pakistan has really made us move like a shift, a big shift in the say towards the geoeconomics. So that should be appreciated. That should be appreciated in Delhi. That should be appreciated in the region and say globally as well. So I end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheen, for your valuable comments. Now I'll invite Dr. Salma Malik. Dr. Malik is an assistant professor at the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, Quaid-e-Azam University. She is highly respected and very well-renowned personality in academic circles here in Pakistan and also also abroad. So with this brief introduction, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mariam. That's an extremely gracious and kind introduction. I'm extremely grateful to you, Mariam, for inviting me, and to IRS, Ambassador Nadeem Riaz. And it's such an honor to be discussant in a panel which has Professor Talbot. Professor Talbot, of course, would not remember, but I was part of a conference in UK, in Birmingham, in which he was leading the panel, and it was a great honor for me. Technically, as Shaheen said, whatever you said, sir, we agree with you, and that rests the case. But as a discussant, I need to do my two-bit here. The points that you have raised are extremely valid and pertinent, and I'm so happy that the IRS today chose Professor Talbot, because he has put together an extremely complicated scenario, looking at its history, linking it with contemporary history to the present and to the future, as well as the emerging threats that are coming up in the region. And if we look at it, if we look at the problem from an angle of sanity and logical rationality, then I think there is no case when it comes to India-Pakistan problem. We should totally be cognizant of these convergence of threat that we see today, in which problems such as the COVID pandemic, climate change, are threat multipliers which are beyond boundaries. They know no boundaries, they know no people, they know no ethnicity, they do not respect religion or anything of that sort. They affect everyone equally. So one cannot sit, glorify in the misery of another actor at such times, because climate change, environmental disasters, another of the points that the professor raised about population movement, these are threats which are going to be of great consequences beyond the purview of nuclear weapons, hi-fi weapon systems, etc., in the coming days. And we really need to put our rational minds together to think of a recipe or a solution which requires a collective effort rather than individual state efforts. But unfortunately, in South Asia, the dynamics are so warped and twisted that at the height of the first peak, just to draw people's sentiments or divert people's sentiment in another direction, the Indian Prime Minister and major decision makers were also heard saying that Pakistan has used the pandemic as a biological weapon against the Indian population, and they are trying to transport it into India and so on and so forth, which are irrational and illogical statements. But for a nation or for a group of people who are more wedded to verbal narration rather than logic, and who are more invested into emotional sloganeering and hyper nationalism, such words coming from the high command, from the chief executive, or the people who are looking after their larger state and trust definitely draw some kind of a street value. And that adds to the sentiment of animosity. So that is at one level where the India-Pakistan's rivalry is being exploited and can be exploited and has been exploited to a greater extent. But a few points that I would very quickly look into, as the professor had raised. One, of course, is a very, very important point. And I think if we, both the countries, come to a realization, then there shouldn't be a Kashmir problem. And that is that we should not have a conversation about Kashmir. We should have the Kashmiris as part of the conversation. They should be the ones who should be leading the conversation. But we are not going to give them a chance to lead the conversation, but they should be an active third party when it comes to deciding their future. Only and then it would be possible for Kashmir to have a sustainable, long-lasting solution with a complete ownership. And that is the basic tragedy to the Kashmir problem. By default and by design, this process is a bilateral process. There is no third option when it comes to Kashmir. It's either India or Pakistan. We don't give the option of Kashmiris to the Kashmiris to decide about Kashmir for their own interest. Our Prime Minister went ahead at the cost of receiving a lot of negative sentiment from people as well, who are invested into hard lines, when he said that tomorrow we are going to allow the Kashmiris to decide for themselves. And that is not something which the Pakistani ears or the South Asian ears are used to listening to. But Pakistan has been for the longest now trying to give Kashmir an out-of-box option so that the problem is resolved for the betterment of the people of the Kashmiris, of Kashmir on both sides. And I really hope we live to see that day when it actually comes about. Unfortunately, where I do agree with Shaheen, that there has been a lot of movement when it comes to intra-Kashmir dialogue, and Shaheen has been part of that, and there have been some very well-meaning people who have invested a lot of energy into the intra-Kashmir dialogue. They have looked at a lot of options, some very uncomfortable options as well, and that has paved path to opening up of a lot of physical channels between both the Kashmirs. But again, from the lens that I look at the intra-Kashmir dialogue or the intra-Kashmir easement processes, that it remains state-controlled. And at the first sign of trouble, this problem, the intra-Kashmir dialogue or even intra-South Asia dialogue between India and Pakistan, the people-to-people contact or any type of positive steps that one takes, it's like an uneasy tango. So it becomes one step forward and three steps backward. So all of these good efforts unfortunately remain victim or have been controlled by the larger hardliner mindset that really tends to control this entire situation and engineer this entire situation. I agree with Professor Talbot when he says that India is going to open Kashmir. And they might do it with a bang on the 5th of August, although that's too close for comfort for India. But India is going to open Kashmir only and when Modi feels confident that he has engineered enough changes within the Indian side of Kashmir to allow Kashmir to open up, and not before that. And unfortunately, when that happens, the changes would have been so monumental that it would be very difficult to reverse them. So it remains a wishful thinking. I beg to differ with you, sir, on this point. But unfortunately, this has been the lesson in history that we have seen. We have also seen time and again the Kashmiri leadership, the loyalist, going through the cycle of being put into prison, put into house arrest, and then cautiously being opened up into a dialogue process with the central government in Delhi. And then they go out, they agree on certain points, then there is a sham election, there's an election process, and then there are assemblies, and so far and so long and so forth. This is what has been happening in Kashmir. And I guess, again, the same type of process is going to get repeated when it comes to Modi again opening Kashmir for the Kashmiris. But what type of Kashmir is going to open for the Kashmiris is going to be a very different Kashmir. It is going to be a Kashmir where a lot of people would be naturalized Kashmiris. It would be a Kashmir where ample domiciles have been dished out to people, so that Modi feels confident that, and I'm also in an alternate universe, also thinking of a fact that India is going to ask the United Nations for a plebiscite, that yes, we are fine enough, let's go for a plebiscite. And that is when they'll feel confident that they have made these changes sufficient enough that the plebiscite is not going to hurt them. So we might look at Kashmir from a very different angle. And so many of the things that we are looking at Kashmir at the moment, the divided lines and so on, might, as a worst case scenario, again, I say quote unquote, as a worst case scenario, may look into some kind of a reality. When it comes to tourism, the low hanging fruits, people centric approach, I think that's a great idea. We have been talking about these ideas. We have been to a point where signing on Siachen Glacier, on Sir Creek, and many other factors have just been a dot away. But again, it has always played whims. It has always played hostage to the whims of the hardliners. We have had people such as Vajpayee trying to make a difference. We've had people such as Manmohan Singh and so many others who genuinely wanted to invest in peace. But the larger politics have moved in such a direction. And I unfortunately don't see a future India which is going to be very Pakistan friendly. I have been to in India till 2013, where there was still hope for conflict transformation that you are talking about. And I really hope and pray that this conflict transformation really happens for the best and for the betterment of the Kashmiris first and foremost, because as you say, Kashmir is the linchpin to the entire peace paradigm of South Asia. If that happens, then a lot of stakeholders may need to leave those deeply entrenched positions that there are. But they have invested so strongly in those deeply entrenched positions that it's now going to be different. India of today, as of 2013, is a very different India. And once the Modi effect is gone, how long the post physical impact of Narendra Modi is going to remain on India is there to see. Because the constituency of peace in South Asia, I'm very sorry to be more pessimistic in this discussion rather than draw optimistic picture. But till 2013, I was a very optimistic South Asian. I still have a lot of Indian friends who are like family to me, and I would love to meet them. We meet them on neutral territories, but meeting each other on our own country's space is becoming a great unlikelihood. And let us see how things work. But there's a huge lineup of hardliners in India, and there appears to be a very, very minuscule, in comparison, lineup of softliners. And the constituency of hatred has become very, very deeply entrenched. There needs to be a lot of hard work and a lot of genuine commitment an uncomfortable moving out of the comfort zone situation, if we want to resort the conflict transformation Professor Talbot is talking about, it is not impossible. It can really be done, but it is going to be a very difficult and arduous task. Thank you very much, Mariam. Thank you, Professor Talbot.
Thank you, Dr. Salma, and thank you for referring to a very pertinent development that we are likely to see, the demographic change in Kashmir. Before asking the question, before opening the question and answer session, I would like President IRS to say a few words. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mariam. It was really a very interesting discussion which took place. The basic thing is it is a troubled relationship. There are no two ways about it. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't really think that there is the chance of any thaw in the immediate future. I have a question because, when you talk about low-hanging fruits, when you talk about back channel diplomacy, when you talk about increasing people-to-people contacts, now all these things are possible when there is a political will. Now, as far as I'm concerned, I don't see any political will on part of the Modi government, and especially on his part. So my question is that in the absence of a political will, can any of the other elements which contribute towards strengthening of ties, can they work? Anybody can answer that question. Thank you very much.
Can I just make a quick response to that and then see what other people come in with? I think that obviously we don't know what a post-Modi India is going to be like and whether he has shifted opinions so much. And here the media, which I think has been mentioned by one or two speakers, is a different element, to what was there in the past. It would depend on the circumstances in which India moves to a post-Modi setup in terms of what the opportunities are and whether there could be a break with this hardline approach. I would say I'm looking at this, I think there won't be much possibility for a complete resolution in the immediate future. However, I do think that people within Pakistan particularly do owe it to Kashmiris to try and keep this dialogue going as best as possible, because even if it's only small steps forward, if this helps the situation, which has been dreadful, facing the Kashmiri population in any small way, then it's worth pursuing it, even if it doesn't look like you're going to go on from that, to a major resolution, of this issue. India isn't going to take the initiative. I think that's a certainty. So I think it's Pakistan's role to take an initiative, perhaps in the realistic knowledge, that this is not going to be a step-by-step process, but it's something which in itself is worth addressing.
And Dr. Salma, would you like to say something?
Thank you, Mariam. I totally agree with Professor Talbot. For the moment, it's going to be a unilateral drive in a sense that India is not going to co-share this peace drive with us. And that is going to make things very difficult, even for the Pakistani leadership, because many a times on the domestic front, the Pakistani leadership has been criticized that when India does not reciprocate your peace gestures, why does Pakistan have to keep on giving the peace signals? So yes, it is actually a very difficult situation. But perhaps from the wisdom that Professor Talbot is talking about, that gives a lot of confidence to another stakeholder that you and me cannot look at because we are not Kashmiris, we are Pakistanis. We are not looking at the fact that the Kashmiris are not looking at India and Pakistan in a similar tone. So I totally agree with the fact that Pakistan needs to make all those peace investments that it is doing, and we must keep on doing that. But you cannot drive the drive alone unless there has to be a reciprocation from the other end. One point that I would just like to add here is that perhaps one aspect that might be able to bring India to the negotiating tables or put some kind of pressure on them is the role of external actors, especially United Nations and others, where there is some threat of sanction or something on India when it comes to India digressing from the United Nations arrangements or resolutions that it has made. And of course, there's a lot of lawfaring in that. So, and I'm actually going in a very generic domain. But the fact is that so long as India feels that there's no pressure on India to perform, it will keep on stepping up its belligerency. So that factor is there. Pakistan may do this solo drive, but for India to at least walk the walk, there has to be sufficient international pressure for them to at least commit to the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salma. Dr. Shaheen, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Mariam. I will just add a point that this generation of Kashmiris, especially the Kashmiri diaspora, is far more proactive for their rights, and it will not be the same conversation, especially in the presence of the social media as well, and so much other opportunities available for expressing their rights. So it will be the Kashmiris will be more assertive. Kashmiri younger generation will be more assertive, and inside the Indian side of Kashmir also, one has to really now look at this new generation of the Kashmiris is the third generation of Kashmiri and second generation of Kashmiri, which are born actually in conflict. So now you see that, and there's a lot of connectivity between the Kashmiris new generation. So first, I mean, in the 90s, even I would say things were happening there, and people came to know about them much later. Now, through the social media and other means of connectivity, they get to know in real time actually. So this factor of the Kashmiris will be very different from what it used to be. So when it comes to the external pressures and all that, so expressing, I mean, their rights kind of a letting people know of, I mean, the people of the world, I would say, because when we say that bringing the aspiration of the people, the Kashmiri, to the forefront in their fight, because they're more credible voices, it will be increasing. So India's attempt to really marginalize them probably will not be successful. So that will be the new factor. The demographic change that Salma talked about is a very important and sensitive issue area. And if you change the demographic realities there, that are going to really directly impact the political settlement or solution there. So the Kashmiris actually, even the non-Kashmiris, I would say, the people from Jammu are quite concerned about it, because it concerns their identity, it concerns their right, it concerns their job opportunities. So it will be, I mean, the many new factors will be emerging. So in the post-Modi, say India or post-Modi India, and the changes that he's trying to bring in Kashmir will be far more complex. But the purpose of that was like to say make Kashmir like integral. Probably is not going to happen. It is to me like totally opposite. Unintended consequences that his government is going to face. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheen. My colleague, Mr. Imran Sardar, had raised the hand. So over to you, Imran.
Thank you very much. It was really nice and enlightening discussion going on. I have rather a comment, not a question, but any panelists can respond to it. With the history of more than 70 years of conflict between India and Pakistan, I think both countries have learned the art of avoiding and dealing each other when necessary, while maintaining their decades-old stances. Both seem okay with the status quo. As President IRS also said that I don't see any urge on both sides of the border to engage with each other for a meaningful relationship. In conflict studies, when certain conflict loses its energy, it becomes very difficult to resolve it. Same is the case with India and Pakistan. The energy lies somewhere else, I think, not between India and Pakistan. For me, the energy lies in the Kashmir itself, the Kashmiris, as Dr. Shaheen also said. Also in the changing geopolitical and geoeconomic situation in the region. These factors might force both countries to go ahead for working relationship. I would love to hear from the panelists whether they agree or disagree with my argument. Thank you.
Thank you, Imran. You're very right. There are many Kashmiris who are also joining militancy against the Indian rule over there. Next question is from Arish Khan. He's the editor of our journal. So over to you, Arish.
Thank you, Mariam, and thank you, Professor Talbot. And it's really an honor. I first got acquainted with you back in the year 2000 when I read your book, Pakistan, A Modern History, its first edition as a student of political science in the University of Peshawar. So it's really an honor to be conversing with you today, even though it's virtual, but it's still a conversation. Sir, my two takeaways from today's discussion are that there should be a mechanism between India and Pakistan to work together. And as all of you panelists have argued, that there are serious common challenges of all South Asian countries, especially if we look at the environment, at the pandemic, other issue areas on which all South Asian countries seriously need to cooperate. So maybe I think we need to further find out and explore options, how we can effectively promote cooperation between South Asian countries on these issues, create platforms for that, so that it could then transform into some peace building between India and Pakistan as well. Yes, sir, Kashmiris need to be put at the center stage when it comes to the resolution of Kashmir dispute. As far as Siachen is concerned, I have a bit of an alternative perspective on Siachen. I do not necessarily agree with the concept of peace park, because it kind of suggests that Indians and Pakistanis are not capable of managing the area on their own, and they need to give it to somebody else, the UN or IUCN or somebody. So I don't think that is a very wise approach. I have actually written a research paper on this in 2012, in which I've called for demilitarization of the Siachen glacier, but with the territories in control of both countries to be kept by the two respective countries and to be managed by them for the protection of the environmental ecosystem of that area. So that is my suggestion on Siachen. I have, sir, three main questions for you, Professor Talbot. As the other panelists and President IRS also pointed out about the vested interests on both sides of the border, and many people argue that there are vested interests on both sides of the border, which might not necessarily want the outstanding disputes between the two countries to be resolved. So how do we get past that, and how do we create that political momentum toward resolving these contentious issues? The second point is that you have rightly pointed out that it's kind of an unfinished agenda of the partition, the Kashmir dispute. So don't you think that the British share some responsibility? They need to step forward, play a role, as historians like you also need to play a role to put the facts straight, and because it's a historical mistake that has taken place. which needs to be corrected. So what's the responsibility of the British government and the British historians like yourself? And my third question is related to what, once again, President IRS mentioned and Imran mentioned, and Professor Salma Malik also mentioned that don't you think that we have now gone past that phase in which we could resolve these conflicts? We've moved so far away from each other in all these years. Like, for instance, if we were talking about resolving this dispute at a time of Jawaharlal Nehru or President Ayub Khan, both of them had a certain amount of experience of each other's territories, and they weren't thinking of each other as negatively as today's leaders of India and Pakistan are. So do you think we have reached a stage from which we cannot go back? Thank you so much, sir.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much for those questions. Looking at those groups who may have an interest, obviously, on both sides of the border in not resolving this, I think that the issue, of course, has come up from time to time about terrorism and cross-border terrorism as a barrier to resolving this. If there's going to be meaningful dialogue, it's got to be taken out of this vulnerable zone, in which things can be done which will basically screw up the chances of making progress. It's somehow or other got to be given an area outside of this sort of context. And I think that was learned that lesson in the past, and it may be that any future dialogue, assuming that there's going to be meaningful future dialogue, has to be really ring-fenced by both sides in an agreement before it's even begun, and saying that whatever happens, we're going to carry on having this dialogue. I think that's an important point, the ring-fencing of dialogue. Britain's responsibility and historians' responsibility. I've always tried, as a British historian, to approach issues on South Asia from a rational, balanced position, and one which does justice to the realities, and not to put forward a particular agenda. And certainly in my writings, I will continue. I can't speak for other historians, what their agendas might be, but certainly I think that is always been an element in my own work. As far as the British government and its ability to impact things, without getting into all the ins and outs of Britain's post-Brexit position, and I don't want to do that. I think Britain's ability diplomatically, and it's always been very strong and able to punch above its weight diplomatically in the world, has been diminished as a result of a Brexit. And it may well be that if you're looking for external players that might be able to bring things forward, if it's not the United States, and of course the United States always has its own particular strategic interest determining it, perhaps Pakistan should explore and deepen its relationship with the EU. I think that the EU has a possible role to play, which is not played in the past, because of the fact that Britain within the EU was quite happy to more or less pass over responsibility for policy and relationships in South Asia to Britain. I think that Britain has lost that to a certain extent. Having said that, I know that there are individual British diplomats, Christian Turner, the current High Commissioner, in Islamabad, who is still very active, in terms of relationships within Pakistan. And Britain obviously does have some advantages over the EU in terms of its history and connections with Pakistan, and of course with India, and access over both sides of the border. So Britain can still play a role, but I wonder whether it will play as prominent a role going forward as it might have done in the past. It's always, of course, interesting to see, as a historian, attempts which come close to success and ultimately fail. Because whilst I accept the point that external actors can put pressure on India, you know, and India as a result may be more amenable to what we've talked about, walking the walk, you know, as far as this is concerned. Ultimately, of course, external actors can't, however much pressure they try to bring to bear, can't make either India or Pakistan take steps which are seen as against their national interest, just in response to external pressure. So I think external actors can help to facilitate dialogue, but there's got to be a desire for dialogue on both sides, and then external actors can help facilitating that process. Your final question about have things moved on too far, I wouldn't want to leave us after this discussion in a situation of despair and say that it's impossible, you know, to conceive of a situation where there isn't going to be meaningful dialogue and a meaningful improvement, whatever form that takes, you know, and until that process begins, we cannot sort of predict. Things are more difficult now. Obviously, there are changes. Some changes perhaps for the better, as we've heard from Dr. Shaheen, the role of the Kashmiri diaspora. I think that can play an important role going forward. We've talked a bit about the role of the media in India, and that's a new factor. Obviously, we've talked about Modi, and we don't know what a post-Modi India would be, but we've got to assume that at some point we will be seeing a post-Modi India, and that that I think is important, you know, to bear in mind that, and it may be that leads to a big change, you know, and a willingness to perhaps rethink things and to be more flexible. We don't know how that circumstances will come about, but I don't think we can say we're in the position now we're never going to be able to move on from this. It's so dreadful that it's impossible. There's lots of people, you know, who are acting individually as well as national governments. You know, this is the other thing. You know, it's not just what national governments can do. It's what other institutions, organizations, groups can achieve as well. So I wouldn't want to leave us in a situation of despair here at all, however bleak we may think the situation is. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Talbot. Dr. Shaheen, would you like to respond to this? Or I have a question from Imran Abbas. Do you want me to take that question?
Yeah.
Please
yes,
go ahead,
yes.
take the question. I just wanted to add what Professor Talbot has said.
Okay, you can add it. Then I'll take
Okay.
it.
Yeah. Thank you. 2 points actually, which are interlinked. Status quo and point of no return. I think there's nothing as such which is status quo. It is always in flux. So what is the status quo of today? If it is like freezing the conflict, you can't freeze the conflict. History tells us that all those frozen conflicts have come back, and they have come back much more aggressively. So unless you resolve them on the long-term basis, what Salma has said, that we have been actually working very hard for conflict transformation, which is, and also for the positive transformation. What are we now facing is negative transformation. So it has in fact reversed all the progress that that has been made in terms of positive conflict transformation. So it is like the status quo and say status quo of today, if you think it is a status quo, may not be of status quo of tomorrow. So to me, status quo itself is in great flux. And the dialogue, you see, again, insight from the history, and we have Professor Talbot with us, tells us that we have far more intractable conflict which were resolved. So it is not that we can't start a dialogue. And in our own history, we had 2001, 2, we had 99, we have wars. In fact, you talked about like the Nehru's time. Imagine these two countries were born at that time in conflict. So bitterness of that time was maybe in the hindsight we think was less. No, I don't think. We had this bitter say water crisis at that time as well. So things were actually far more worse to me, but still both sides finally resorted to dialogue. And it is to me to what extent one can say what is the opportune moment, you see, in terms of ripeness. So it is like the external facilitation that we are talking about is trying to really generate a right moment, that we have so many common shared threats looming. Can we really come together to really cope with them? And this climate change is not really something independent of Kashmir. You see, you have the Himalayas, same Himalayas, okay, which are melting. So you have the shared Himalayas, you have the shared glaciers, which are melting. So the water, crisis, which is also linked with that, the environmental crisis, which is linked with that, is also somehow in one way or the other is linked with the conflict as well, or the issues related with that. So just wanted to really add. Mariam, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shaheen. I can see a raised hand from Imran Abbas. Please introduce yourself and over to you.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm Imran Abbas, Assistant Professor, Department of Politics and International Relations, Sargodha University. Just hearing about all the panelists saying about the India-Pakistan peace process succeeding, but for any peace process to succeed, you need to create an environment where there are positive dominoes that can actually affect one after another. May it be a low-hanging fruits and eventually going towards a Kashmir solution. Now, not to distract your discussion, but we can have a catalyst like the situation in Afghanistan. Now, Pakistan and Indians are apparently opposing each other on an Afghan solution. With such an environment that is taking place, it becomes very difficult to come back to the common issue of Kashmir. So my question is to Dr. Salma, how you see that if the two countries are opposing each other in Afghanistan and then the momentum develops and they talk about Kashmir, which is unlikely to happen, even so, that the Indians are worried about the possible outfall of an Afghanistan outcome towards the Kashmir. That's how the Indians' lenses are. So we need to read out how Indians see about Kashmir and what's happening in Afghanistan or other issues. Because we can imagine that Pakistan and India, other than Kashmir, are either working on some common issues or agendas or not working on common issues and agendas. That would be the momentum required for solving a Kashmir solution eventually. So to talk about the low-hanging fruits, what are the incentive for India if you are opposing each other on other issues? Now, my second point is that everybody's talking about a post-Modi India. Now, you remember at one time, Prime Minister Imran Khan had made this comment that a strong Indian government, may it be under Modi, will be actually able to make some bold steps towards solving Kashmir. A weaker government, a coalition government, even in the post-Modi or a post-BJP government will not be able or dare to go for any solution. That's what we hope from a Congress-led government. Now, taking this into point and then thinking about the Indian political dynamics, Modiism has succeeded in India to some extent. And that has succeeded in India in having an anti-Pakistan rant. So will it be possible for a post-Modi, post-BJP government to undo what has happened in Kashmir on the 5th August 2019 and then be able to survive within the Indian political culture that has been since the Modi has arrived? So post-Modi, and how can we be so sure that the post-Modi will not be post-BJP or it would be a BJP government? So a stronger government may be in a good position to actually solve this process, which I just take the link from what Prime Minister Imran Khan intended to say about that the Modi government will be able to make some bold steps. But even in that case, if the Modiism continues, we have to see what Modiism is offering to Kashmiris. They are offering to Kashmiris that integrating into India brings socio-economic benefits. So what counter socio-economic benefits can be offered which are not limited to Kashmiris, but are actually for everyone in the subcontinent. And then that creates an environment that will lead toward a possible solution to Kashmir. That's my opinion and a question in itself.
Thank you, Imran. But Dr. Salma has left. She had a commitment. So I would like Dr. Talbot to respond to it. So over to you,
Yeah.
sir.
I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to see exactly what a post-Modi government in India would look like. As far as whether from a position of strength, it would be on his terms, or of his successors' terms, if there was any dialogue, because there is this ideological commitment from the BJP in terms of integrating Jammu and Kashmir into India. This has been a long-held policy. I mean, obviously, one needs to think about why was it actually adopted in August 2019, but it wasn't something that the BJP hadn't been talking about for a long time. And I suspect, actually, to turn the argument on its head, was because earlier BJP governments probably felt less strong than Modi did. You know, and that's why this particular decision was taken. So I would be very concerned to think that Modi or anyone that's following in his footsteps closely, you know, would actually be prepared to do the kind of rollback and flexibility in approach that is necessary to move things forward. I think that there might at some point be an exhaustion of hyper-nationalism in India, particularly ultimately all of these governments which are of that stripe failed to deliver on their rhetoric ultimately. I think already, despite attempts at deflecting blame for the COVID pandemic onto Muslims, there are people that would have been supportive of Modi before the pandemic from the majority community that are less so now. So that I think that we can't assume that Modi is sort of entrenched, and we certainly can't think if he is entrenched, you know, that it's from a position of strength of that government that there's actually going to be meaningful dialogue. As far as trying to integrate Kashmiris and to socio-economically benefit them, I think that the groups that will benefit by integration of the region are Hindu capitalists who are moving into the area, that they will be the people who will benefit by having access to land and opportunities, and that ordinary Kashmiris will probably not be benefiting in the way that the rhetoric of the government would indicate. So that I think that in a sense, the marginality, economic, social, cultural marginality of Kashmiris, which has always been there, you know, has just been exacerbated by this decision. So I don't think they would necessarily rest easy, you know, with just rhetoric of saying how much they benefited as a result of these particular actions. But I don't know if other panelists have got any comments they want to make around those issues.
Thank you, Dr. Talbot. We have a question in the chat box. It's a question from my colleague. She wants to know that why the miseries of Kashmiris and the unilateral actions taken by India cannot impact upon, could not impact upon the influential forums like United Nations Security Council. So what do you think that what kind of offensive Pakistan can use, diplomatic offensive,
Yes.
to highlight these changes?
I think the problem is, I mean, obviously it's become polarized in Pakistan internal domestic politics, and I don't want to be commenting on that, you know, that the present government hasn't done enough. I think the present government has certainly tried to raise these issues in international forums. The problem is, of course, that you can raise the issues, but if it's not within the perceived interests of the powerful countries within the UN, on the Security Council, or even within the Assembly for that matter, then you're not going to get anywhere with doing this. You know, and at the moment, you could say that there is a silence over what's been happening in the Indian occupied areas because of the fact that it's not within the interest of key players within the UN to be highly critical of India. Initially, of course, because of India's growing economic importance post-globalization, but also, of course, as I think I said right at the beginning of my talk, that there is a lot of discussion going on in think tanks and probably in governments, you know, in the UK, in EU, and certainly in the United States, you know, about the rise of China and the threat that this is seen to be. And obviously the Biden administration has carried on the Trump rhetoric, you know, against China. And to contain China, I mean, obviously there's all kinds of other countries you can bring into play in the wider region, you know, Japan being one of them, obviously the role of Australia in the wider region. But India is inevitably seen, you know, in these kind of strategic contexts as playing an important role in helping to contain China. So you don't want to be putting too much public pressure, at least, you know, on India over Kashmir in that context. So I think that is the context in which efforts which the Pakistan government are making diplomatically, you know, are only going to have a certain amount of traction.
Thank you, Dr. Talbot. I have just last question I posted in the chat box also. I really wanted to know that you once said that Pakistan's partition struggle was more anti-Hindu rather than anti-British. Since you have minutely worked on details of partition, so why do you think that a person like Jinnah, who was a preacher of Hindu-Muslim unity, became a preacher of two-nation theory? Why do you think that his mind changed? What made him change his mind?
I mean, I think his mind. I mean, obviously, this is I could digress for an hour or more on this, but I won't. I'll keep it. I'll keep it very confined. The point was that Congress, despite standing for secular values, as it always said, had a strong Hindu nationalist subgroup within it. And also, of course, then you had organizations like RSS, you know, outside of the formal politics, but nonetheless becoming increasingly sort of assertive, you know, from the 1920s onwards. So there was, I think, a growing realization of where would Indian Muslims fit in a post-independence India? You know, would their rights, would their culture, would their religion actually be protected? And I'm sure Jinnah, with a reluctance probably, you know, came round to the view ultimately that there couldn't be guaranteed, however much he might have seen the desire at an earlier stage in his career for Hindu-Muslim unity to certainly put pressure on the British. The Lucknow Pact, you know, is a key example there. Nonetheless, there was this concern. And whilst obviously there were people like Nehru, for example, who had a more secular approach within Congress, there was, I think, a realization that these people may have been in the minority within the Congress. And then, of course, there was this whole period, and I don't want to sort of digress on this, but the 1937 to 39 governments run by Congress after the first elections in the provinces where Muslims were in a minority. Some of the actions of these governments obviously raised concerns, you know, in terms of, despite what Congress was saying, you know, how was it acting, or how was its local branches, if you like, acting, within government. So I think that's the context, in which we have to understand this shift, that Jinnah makes.
So we have come to an end to our discussion. Thank you very much, Dr. Ian Talbot. I would extend my deepest thanks to you for sparing time for us. Your writings are truly balanced and based on facts. Your research is basically based on hermeneutics, which is very difficult, obviously. Thank you very much for being with us. Actually, the nation formation of both India and Pakistan is based on making the other an antagonist, which Dr. Talbot has referred to in one of his works as the history trap of history, I guess.
That's
However,
right.
but yes, however, we hope that maybe one day both nations will have a pragmatic leadership which can steer both countries from chauvinistic nationalism to mutual benefit of all. So we don't want to end in despair either. So with these thoughts, I would also like to thank our esteemed discussants. Thank you very much, Dr. Salma and Dr. Shaheen, my colleagues, our IT team, and participants for listening and their active participation. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Talbot. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mariam. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Tal.